is a passage in Clem's narrative after his mother, who suffers greatly with paranoid schizophrenia. At the time, much less was known about this kind of mental illness. This takes place in the 1950s. And at the time, his mother was quite happy and experiencing a very good period. She was pregnant with her fourth child, and this moment marks a time when the storm clouds, if you will, of her mental illness are brewing again after a period of relative peace and harmony in the family. Something else about my mother was beginning to change. She would take in a spoonful of cereal and stop, as if she was all of a sudden confused about who was sitting with her. It only took a few seconds for her face to soften as she remembered me, and then she resumed her chewing. But I was beginning to feel that I was watching my mom in an old movie that suddenly froze on one picture, then started up as quickly as it had stopped. Once again, her eyes stayed on me, puzzled and impatient. She hadn't done that for a while. I stared out the window when she looked at me like that. Something was coming back to my mother, like a whisper hidden in a gust of wind. She seemed to be listening with curious anticipation, as if trying to remember words from a song she hadn't heard for a long time. I felt like something good was struggling to stay with her, and something bad was bullying its way back. The arguments between my parents started up again. My father came home at lunchtime almost every day. He was worried about her, but he couldn't help bossing Mom around. She didn't like it one bit. The Word of God was finding its voice in my mother's side of their disagreements. If Dad lectured her about her diet, and she was at the end of a pregnancy and gaining weight too quickly for her health, she gave it right back, telling him to nourish his own soul with the body and blood of Christ. Their quarrels became more heated and more frequent. My father returned to work more worried and upset than when he'd come home. Once again, my brothers and I had crossed the border into the familiar territory of uncertainty as we waited for whatever came next. Setting things on fire all the time lately. I've got to stop. The second thing. Stop that. Jeez. Lent is the season 40 days before Easter when Christians are invited to enter into deep reflection on sin, brokenness, suffering, and penitence. In the Jewish calendar, this inner work occurs in September during the days of awe, Yom Kippur. The parallels are very close. It's a somber season, and one that I think worthy for religious liberals and non-religious folks to consider adopting because of the opportunity it presents to really go into that place of acknowledging evil and sin. We have a very optimistic theology in our own Unitarian and Universalist tradition, and sometimes we kind of skate over, the sin and the brokenness. We see evidence of brokenness in the human condition all around us, and we experience it within ourselves all the time. But we're very good at being in denial or repressing it or just kind of trying to move past it or do, self-esteem kinds of maneuvers around it instead of really going in there, gathering it in, and honoring it, really. We're very good, most of us, at looking at the brokenness in the world. We say, oh, okay, there's sin or there's evil, and I'm going to climb in there and I'm going to try to fix it, I'm going to transform it or better it. But when it comes to inward repentance, it's not that we don't want to do it because we're bad. I think it just scares people. Like, why, it's too big to look at for a lot of people. Most of us have enough guilt, shame, and insecurity to keep us up nights as it is, without setting aside any special season to do so. And I understand that. But there's a difference between that kind of lonesome, alone, ashamed, embarrassed, mean inner talk that plagues us and that is unwelcome and unproductive. And that kind of work, that kind of open and honest conversation and inward reflection that we can do in religious community in a way that is careful and compassionate and not just unproductive beating ourselves up. And the difference between the late night self-flagellation and self-anger and doing it in a way that has compassion is grace. Grace is a really hard theological concept for us to define and to grasp. The traditional definition of grace is that it is unearned love, freely bestowed. You think of that old hymn, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. In the classical Unitarian and Universalist tradition, grace defines the relationship between the human being and the divine. That there is this love that will not let us go. The writer Anne Lamott has this great expression. She writes, "My mind is a dangerous neighborhood that I shouldn't go into alone," which is so true. The season of Lent provides a time, it's like a container for us to go into that scary neighborhood alone. To go into it together. Last weekend we had our UU and UUCGL session, and someone who is a brand new member of this church asked about confession. And I said, well, we don't have a sacrament of confession as Unitarian Universalists, but that's a good question, because we really should have a time where we feel that we can go into those shadow parts of our souls and psyches and give them some attention and maybe share what burdens us with someone else. Not to be forgiven, because no one else can forgive us unless it's the person that we have harmed, but to just air it out, to say, this is me struggling with being human. We really can't do good or be good for ourselves or the world if we don't give those shadowy parts of our psyche some fresh air and light. What grace assures us is that no matter how broken we are, in whatever condition we are in, we are held in a common embrace. Now, I want to tell you that I think of grace, I prefer to think of grace in those terms, being held in a common embrace, rather than being loved by God, which is another way of expressing grace, unearned love. Because my sense of God is not a personal mother, father God who loves me in that way. Do you know what I mean? I think that that's a beautiful concept, and I don't mind saying those words. I talk to God like a parent sometimes. But my lived experience of the Spirit of God, if you will, is more cosmic than that. It's not personal. My sense of God is of an energy, a universal consciousness, more than it is an intimate parent relationship. The way that God loves does not feel the same to me as the way a human loves. And it's probably because I've never been loved perfectly by any human being. And if you have been, I just want to say you are really lucky. And some of you may feel that you have been. Words are really difficult when it comes to expressing mystical realities and truths. But let me try. I think that grace tells us that everything in creation, that everything that has a consciousness, and I think trees have a consciousness, and stones and grass and all of those, that everything in creation is held in one reality, and the nature of that reality is the profoundest kind of understanding, compassion, and acceptance. Acceptance like you have never experienced it from another human being. Acceptance that's beyond forgiveness. Acceptance that is such a profound intimacy that nothing can break it, and that makes you one of one nature with that which is holding you and all of us. Whoever wrote the Psalms thousands of years ago expressed this intimacy, this embrace that I believe expresses what grace is. in Psalm 139, the sense of God being this force that knows you, that embraces and holds you always. And here the psalmist, and this is a translation by Stephen Mitchell, the psalmist says, God, you have searched me and known me. You understand everything that I do. You are closer to me than my own thoughts. You see through my selfishness and weakness into my inmost self. There's not one corner of my mind that you do not know completely. You are present before me, behind me, and you hold me in the palm of your hand. Such knowledge is too awesome to grasp, so deep that I cannot fathom it. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? And the psalmist means this in a good way, not like God is tracking him down. He means this in this blessed way. If I take the wings of the morning and fly to the ends of the sea, even there your hand will guide me and your spirit will give me strength. If I rise to heaven, I meet you, and if I lie down in hell, you are there. So this presence, this embrace follows us, is with us, is holding us. The love is so great, even if we are in hell, it is there. And of course, when I think about Clem's story and his mother, who often lived in that hell of the delusional mind and her mental illness, she's held there, even so. This memoir is about grace, Dancing with Fireflies. It could have been a memoir about suffering. It could have been one of those typical memoirs about being a survivor, which is a typical framework for a book about growing up with a mentally ill parent or an addicted parent, abusive or sick parent. We've had many, many of those over the years. To just report the harrowing story, as many authors do. They kind of report the harrowing story of what it was like to live with this parent, and they share the hopeful news, I survived, and so can you. But Clem Schoenbeck's story is about grace. It tells the story of this boy growing up, the oldest of three sons, in Pennsylvania in the 1950s, living in many ways a really all-American life of baseball and going to school, playing pranks with his brothers, growing a garden, and being a good Catholic boy. But in this family, the boys and their father, their extended family, and their community are coping together with the sad, frightening, and volatile nature of a mother who is in the grips of paranoid schizophrenia. And their mother's delusions, Sophie's delusions, take the form of a religious fanaticism, voices that torment her with threats of hell and damnation, which lead her to occasionally find some peace in the prayers and rituals provided by kind and loyal parish priests. And this story is a beautiful testament to the ways that religious community and ministry can be effective. But the voices more often enthrall and paralyze and confuse Sophie, stealing her from her family and imprisoning her in the rocking chair she takes to for hours and even days of ceaseless, agitated rocking. Those voices always with her, unless she gets a blessed break from them on occasion, but they're there. Her boys learn to sleep with one eye open, living, as the author says, like nervous weathermen scouting the horizon for early warnings of their mother's agitated outbursts. Her delusions caused this suffering woman and her family much pain and loss and even agony. But she loves them, and they love her. And there are moments of light and joy, even in all the years of suffering. The reason I found this book so powerful that I chose it for a congregational read is that, as I said earlier, it's not merely framed as the story of a survivor, which it certainly could have been, and it would have been a fascinating memoir if it had been framed that way, but it is framed, unbelievably enough, as the story of a penitent, someone who intentionally chooses to say, I am not a victim. I am a human being who did the best that I could to love and accept love given to me in a broken and flawed way by a mother who loved me the best she could. And I believe, looking back now as an adult, that I have amends to make, which is something very few memoirs of this sort offer, is that sense of, I now want to make amends to my mother. This staggers me. We do not generally tell our stories of suffering, abuse, and pain in this matter, but Clem does. And the fact that he's here right now makes this really interesting to talk about. The profoundest contribution of this book, in my opinion, is that the author manages to tell the story of his mother, his father, his brothers, and himself with compassion for all of them, with true, genuine sympathy for their terrible, harrowing suffering. And that he goes back, while sympathizing with the boy he was and loving and understanding that boy's heart, he also recognizes, he goes back in honesty and recognizes that boy's anger and hatred of a mother whose mental illness caused her to do terrible things. As an adult author, he repents. He expresses regret and sorrow over that anger because he no longer wants or needs it. It is not productive to him. He aims to fix it, to redeem it. He aims to heal that anger and resentment the only way that we really can heal anger and resentment, which is through gaining more understanding and clarity about the one who harmed us. In this case, for Clem, his mother's experience and what she was going through. And he tries to fill in the spaces of the narrative that he was not privy to at the time. This is the grace that any of us, human and flawed as we are, can extend to each other. The redemption of compassion, deeper understanding for those who have unintentionally harmed us. And that's a big, important distinction. There's a very different process to redeem a relationship with someone who has intentionally harmed us. And that's called restorative justice. And that's a different sermon for a different time. So we offer each other this grace. And in doing so, as Clem experiences, we may come to experience the grace of God, the deep knowing that we are held in that common embrace, that deep peace, eternal and inexpressible, that will never forsake and abandon us. In coming to the end of his memoir, after he has carefully and sensitively taken out all the skeletons from his family closet, after he has gently waltzed with them, after he has spoken his truth and found and celebrated whatever loveliness and beauty and strength there is in the narrative of his story and suffering, Clem Schoenbeck prepares to put down his pen. He is almost at the end of his story and is finishing his memoir with a poem about his mother. On the last night of his writing, or the second to last night of his writing at 2 a.m., Clem feels someone in the room with him. His wife Bonnie is asleep. The dog he sees is curled quietly up in her bed. But he has this very distinct sense of a presence in the room with him. But no matter, he will go to bed, he will finish tomorrow. The next night, the writer returns to the task of finishing his story, of laying to rest the old demons, ghosts, and spirits of memory. His tribute and his redemption are almost done. And then the presence returns. He has a direct, unmistakable experience of grace. Because beyond the bonds of time, beyond the bondage of the mind, beyond the pain of the human suffering, he is brought into awareness. He is given the gift of knowing that he and his mother are together in the same space and time. They are held together in grace, the eternal security of all-embracing love. And he writes, again, behind me. Suddenly I know it's my mother. She's been here for 2 nights. Now her hand resting on my right shoulder, the soft touch easily mistaken for a wrinkled seam of my shirt pressing against me. But after all this work, I know my mother. She's been watching and waiting. She's stepped out of the failing afternoon light and unsettling noise of my childhood visit when I was 8 and she was lost. She's come into this night to be with me. She looks over my shoulder and reads my poem, my apology, my acknowledgement of her love, my recognition that she never asked for the turmoil of her life. Are we okay, Mom? We are good, she says. I hope that you will join Clem and join together in conversation about the themes of this book, that I have asked Clem to say whatever he would like in response to what I have just said, as a kind of an opening of the conversation that will continue later in the season after hopefully you've had a chance to read his book.
I guess the first thing I should say is I'm sorry I don't have a truckload of books out there. If I get a little choked up, I will have to explain that one of the benefits of writing this book for me is that I could feel what I'm feeling now. I spent so much of my life with my brothers with that wall of denial between what we were expected to do and what we felt. And the true gift of this work has been that I can really feel what I should have felt in those days. Vicki referred to something bigger, a bigger presence. And there's no question that I had the energy to write this memoir with the support of something bigger than me. I'm not uncomfortable calling that presence God, but I can't define it. I believe when I look back at the whole process, there was a hand that guided me through this. I never was interested in writing until a little over 20 years ago, when my daughter, who's here today, gave birth to my first granddaughter. And I saw her about a half an hour after her birth in my daughter's arms, and she was wrapped and swaddled in white, a pink hat in her head, and words came to me, they have been here forever. I have no idea where that came from. But I went home and I started writing, Hallmark stuff about my granddaughter. And I have a dear friend, an author by the name of Dennis Must, who was a patient of mine, and I started to share this with him. We'd spend 45 minutes out of each hour appointment talking about each other's families. And one day, Dennis started to encourage me to have the poetry published. And he said to me, your poems are going to go somewhere that you have no idea about. Pay attention. And I believe, people ask me sometimes, how long ago did you start writing the memoir? And there are two answers. I could say 5 or 6 years ago, but the more I think of it, the honest answer is 20 years ago when I wrote my first poem, because the poetry started to lead me toward the unfinished business with my mother. And that unfinished business was that I had carried with me from my teenage years such anger and these wishes of wanting her to be dead. And I outgrew that, but I was well into my middle age before I realized I really owe my mother an amend, a true, I am so sorry. And it had to be for me, maybe even more than for her. But by the time I was mature enough to know she had never asked for this illness, she was becoming senile. And I thought to myself, well, she wouldn't understand what I'm saying. I meant well, end of story. And it was not the end of the story, because later, as I got older, I started to have dreams of seeing her in the mental institution and this sort of thing, dreams that would wake me up. And it was not until I finished this book that those dreams went away. The poetry pointed me toward it. We had a reunion of my cousins in shortly before the 9/11 event. Big family, 33 cousins that we grew up with, and some of them closer than others, but we all brought information about our family, pictures and so on. It was a gathering of history that went into this memoir, long before I knew that I was going to be doing this. But when it was time for me to write this, I needed to also write my mother's history, which is fascinating. Her parents both immigrating from Germany, and what they went through. And because I did not want this to be, as Vicki said, a story about blaming my mother, it was, at the end of the story, to understand what she dealt with, because it was so intertwined with my story. So there was, and then I was invited to join a short story writers group as a result of my poetry, and I thought, I don't know how to do this. And turns out that after being in this group for a few years, my best short stories were about growing up. And one day somebody in the group, when I said the well is dry, they said, why don't you write a memoir? You've already started it. And so a lot of those stories have been woven into the final memoir. But the bottom line, if I were to tell you the message that I share with everybody, and I don't want to sound like I'm preaching, but it's, if I were preaching to myself, the message is that if you have unfinished business, think about it. I had to deal with it, and it took me a long time to deal with it. I don't think I could have dealt with it when I was 50 years old. But now I'm in that time zone where, you're not going to do it now. Check it out, But if there's unfinished business, think about it. And if it's something that you have to deal with, there's the grace. Final comment. I've always looked at certain people and envied the grace. Our friend George Richardson, who was with us in the choir for so long and a member of this church, I looked at him with the elegance and the graceful person that he was, and I thought, wow, I'd like to have a little bit of that. If what Vicki says is true, that grace is unearned love and support, I have had it. Not only from this book, from kind people I've known, from my family, from my wife, my daughter, who has supported me through this effort. But if that is the definition of grace, I got a lot, and I can loan you some. Thank you so much, Vicki. Thank you.